Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's Thursday night. We're on the Smart Connected group, and I have got such a treat for you tonight. We've got the amazing James Burtt. Welcome, James.
Hello, Jane. Good to see you. We've known each other for years, but we haven't connected for a little while. So yeah, it's good to see you again.
I know. I remember we were on a 4-day mastermind, weren't we, many moons ago? We sat on the same table, and when you're sitting on the same table with somebody for 4 days in a row, you really get to know them well, and you actually create a bit of a bond. So it's so lovely to be able to reconnect, and having seen your progress over the years. You're a dad now, aren't you? And you're doing all this exciting podcasting stuff.
Yeah, I am indeed. Yeah, so I wasn't young, free, and single, but I was married and no attachments and kids. I remember before I had kids thinking I was busy, and now I think, what the hell was I doing with all of my spare time? So yeah, lots changed in the preceding 5 or 6 years since we first met. But yeah, for both of us from the looks of it, because I see your star shining brightly onwards and upwards as well, which is fantastic to see.
Thank you. So you've been very, very busy over lockdown, haven't you, James? And I think maybe the best place to start is by talking about what you've been up to, because it's very exciting for anybody that's interested in podcasting. So fire away.
Yeah, absolutely. So I now run a company called the Ultimate Podcast Group. So I started doing podcasting in 2017, and the day that I launched, I listened to a podcast called How to Launch a Podcast by a guy called John Lee Dumas, who does Entrepreneur on Fire, very, very big podcast. And it's like this free training thing. And I was like, well, let me just listen to this podcast and see what happens. So I listened to it, and I've got 14 years worth of broadcast and branding and media experience. It's like, well, if I add on the stuff I know about marketing and the stuff that this guy's giving away in this free podcast training, I wonder what would happen. So the day that I launched, Tim Ferriss was number 1, I was number 2, and Gary Vee was number 3. Wow. I was like, well, that worked out quite well. Now, don't get me wrong, Tim Ferriss and Gary Vee have probably done better than I have in the podcast stakes, but it was nice to be their mate for even a couple of weeks, which was cool. And then off the back of that, I got asked to sort of launch other people's podcasts. So from 2017 to now, as I mentioned to you a minute ago off air, I've launched 128 podcasts now. 85 to 90% of the people that I work with end up in the iTunes top chart. So I'm people have now given me the nickname of the podcast king, which I thought to start with, I was like, that is so cheesy. But now I kind of like it because people keep tagging me as the king on LinkedIn. I'm like, oh, do you know what? I'm just going to go with it. I'm going to get some t-shirts printed, maybe like a rubbish crown.
My podcast journey started last year when I actually joined Rob Moore's Marketing Mastermind, and I realized that everybody else on it was doing podcasts, and I'd never even thought about this before. And I thought, well, you know what? I've just launched a book, and actually a podcast is a very creative thing. It could be an extension to the book. And once I started doing it, I thought, this is so great. This is so creative. You can take it in so many different directions. And I just fell in love with the whole podcasting thing. But
it's amazing. It really is. It's an exploding marketplace, and it's still, because it's really, I say it's new, it's not. It's been around since 2003, but it's going through a bit of a third revolution now at the moment. So it's kind of like the Wild West. There's no rules and regulations. There's no way, set formats or formulaic ways that stuff has to be done. The shortest podcast is like a minute. The longest podcast is like Joe Rogan, which is 4.5 hours, and he'll get Elon Musk on and smoke drugs and like lose $1 billion off the stock price of Tesla and all this kind of weird and wonderful stuff. But yeah, it's a very exciting marketplace. And it's also to your point there, I know a couple of the other people who were on that mastermind. I helped Dan and Amy to launch their first podcast, the Property Vault, back in the day. And I know that a lot of people that Rob was trained, he was like, you've got to be doing a podcast. It's essential. It absolutely is. It's an integral part of the marketing mix now. But there's still only 1.3 million podcasts that are registered to Apple. Wow. So where is it you sort of go, oh, everyone's doing one? Well, everyone in our space is, because everyone's an entrepreneur and everyone's like trying to build their own business and build their personal brand. But it's not everyone that's doing it, if that makes sense. There's 1.3 million active podcasts, as opposed to 48 million active Facebook fan pages. So even if you just took sort of like Facebook or podcasting, if you could do one or the other, you got a much better chance of getting genuine cut through via a podcast, because it is still a medium that not everybody understands, basically, is one of the big plus points of it.
And I think the nice thing about it is that on the whole, unless obviously you want to do your own ads or you want to, get a sponsor or whatever, on the whole, they're very ad free, aren't they? So there's just pure value and pure content. So I personally love to listen to podcasts as well. And I think most podcasters, they don't just create, they're also podcast fans, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the really good ones, anyway, are podcast fans first and foremost. So I definitely was. I remember I listened to. I was on somebody else's show the other day, and they're like, "What was the first podcast you listened to?" And I realised it was actually in 2011 where I listened to my first ever show, and it was a guy called what was he called? Scott something. It was called The Daily Boost. And it was this guy in America. I used to pay $10 a month to get his podcast. They used to be emailed through. So you used to get an MP3 via email. That's how long ago it was.
Wow.
But I listened to this guy start this business. And then when he started this podcasting, he was like, oh my God, I've got 1,000 of you who are listening. I was like, well, hang on, I can do that simple. I've got 1,000 people he sends emails to, $10, that's 10 grand. He's doing quite well here. But while I was listening, I mean, he lost his wife and he talked through that process. He moved to a different location. He found a new love of his life. They bought a farm. And I just went on this journey with this guy. And I was, sometimes I'd be like sitting on the train to a job I hated with like tears in my eyes, listening to what this guy was going through. I was like, I love this medium. And then I was like, I wonder if anybody else does a podcast. And then like the latest, I think it was the iPhone 3 came out and it had a podcast app on it. And then I discovered the School of Greatness podcast. By a guy called Lewis Howes over in the States. And that was it. That was me hooked. And I remember I was out in Australia in 2014. I was there for my brother-in-law's wedding. And I went out running. And they had a beautiful, they had like a beach house down by the coast in Australia. And this sounds like it's made up, but genuinely this actually happened. I went out and I listened to a podcast. I was running along. I was like, I would love to do this. It was I had mad jet lag. So I got up at like 4:30 in the morning. Oh. And the family said to me, if you go out running at about 4:30, you might see the wild big red kangaroos. So I'm running along, listening to this podcast for the first time, going, I want to do what this guy does and make a difference to the world. The sun was coming up over this beach. And then I saw like a herd of giant red kangaroos. And it was like the most almost closest thing to like a spiritual moment that I've ever had. And I was like, I need to do a podcast. This is my calling. And then I sort of forgot about it for about 5 years. And I came back to it later on.
That's such an incredible story. I just I had that image in my head of the huge herd of red kangaroos and the beach at 4:30 in the morning.
It was genuinely, it was amazing.
Of inspiration.
It was, and I didn't know what it was that he did, but I was like, I'd love to do what that guy does. And I remember I had it in my head. I was like, I would love to do what he does as a job. I'll find out whatever it is. And imagine, and this time I was 26, 27. I was like, imagine if I could do that and I had, like say 30 grand cash in the bank, then I'd be rich, which is what you think at 25. I'd be rich beyond my wildest dreams. I'd have this money in the bank and I'd be making a difference. And I remember the time when I was back in Australia actually, and a payment had popped up and I saw one of my bank accounts had popped over 30 grand and I was listening to Lewis Howes again. But 5 years later, I was like, oh my God, I've actually, the thing that I said that I want to do, which I completely forgotten about, this dream of 5 years ago, which I hadn't really chased it, had just happened again. So I actually sent him a voice note. I said, man, you were the inspiration behind this 5 years ago. And it's just happened again sort of thing. And he messaged me back actually. He's like, oh, this is why I do it for comments like that. So that was awesome.
Oh, that's really great. So, James, you're doing it now. You've got an amazing podcast yourself, and you're helping other people to, really bring their dreams and their message to the world, which is fantastic. But I also wanted to talk about something that I know you've gone into and on your live videos, and I've been watching them, and they're really, really good, which is really also about how to make a podcast work for you commercially, because of course we're all business owners, but podcasting isn't free. People think that it is, but it costs time and money, and so we all want to get a return on our investment if we're entrepreneurs. So let's just kind of go into that a little bit, because that's something that you really understand quite well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. This is probably the query that I get most from people when they're sort of like, they reach out and they're like, hey, I've heard you on the podcast, King. How do I make money out of a podcast? I'm like, well, if that's your first question, then we're starting off on a bad footing. But I get it. Like I'm a business owner, and if you can't put cash in the till, then fundamentally a business is there to make profits and money. And in a lot of, that's what I love about the entrepreneurial world. You know, people talk about how much money they've got, how much money they made, how much money they lost. We're very open and honest with that kind of stuff. Whereas to the outside world, and it's not like an us and them thing, but to the outside world, you know, talk about money over the dinner table is a disgusting thing. So no, it's not, because that's how the world moves round. But fundamentally, if you want to go into podcasting just to make money, you're coming at it from the wrong place. If you love it and you can see that you've got a message to communicate and you can add value to an audience, and as a byproduct you make money, that's great. So I launched a podcast, as I mentioned, in 2017. I then subsequently launched a coaching brand and a branding agency off the back of that. So I've done 6 and 7 figures literally from a podcast, but I didn't make any of the money directly through the podcast. I know that Rob is someone who you've worked very closely with. He calls it trickle down revenue. And I call it auxiliary money. It's almost experts, mentors, investors, business owners, people, consultants, you know, people who make their money within the expert economy, or they charge for their services.
Indeed.
You are going to make a lot more money via your podcast if you use your podcast as a genuine brand building tool, but understanding that it's a massively powerful call to action medium. You can build brand awareness, but I've worked in branding and PR, and it's a bit of a term that's, oh, well, it's great for brand. Okay, well, what did it do for the bottom line? That's what I care about. But if you build your brand, that's where you will monetize it. I actually did it as a test. So one of the podcasts that I used to work with, we're getting like 25, 30,000 downloads a month. And we had a streaming platform approach us and say, hey, we'd like to advertise with you. And I was like, okay, cool. I've never done it before, but I was like, as a podcast expert, I better do it to understand the process. Yes. So bearing in mind, this is a podcast that's helped me to launch 6 and 7 figure businesses. In terms of ad revenue directly through those podcasts, made $96. And I was like, I don't like this platform. I'm going to pull the content off it and put it back onto the old platform. So you make the majority of your money as an auxiliary. So you'll be a prime example of this. You'll get investors for your property deals. You'll get people into your mastermind and into your programs, and you'll sell books via podcasting. You'll do exactly the same from being a guest on other people's podcasts. So it's not so much the direct revenue, because you can't even advertise on podcasts in the majority of platforms until you're doing over 10,000 downloads a month, which a lot, you know, the majority of podcasts will never get to 10,000 downloads a month, frankly. But again, you don't necessarily need to. I had a guy reach out to me the other day, and he said, you know, what does it take to create a successful podcast? I said, well, it completely depends on your definition of success. What are you trying to do with this? Do you want to get 1,000 listeners? That would be success. Do you want to get 100 listeners, but you know you can convert 10% of those people into clients? That would be success. Do you want 10 listeners, but you convert all of them to become clients? Do you want to make a difference and make an impact? Do you want to be able to connect with people? You know, I've spoken on stage with Les Brown and interviewed Grant Cardone, Elena Cardone, and Mr. Universe, and I've given keynote talks in Melbourne and South Africa and America, and I've been invited to go and meet the world's leading human biologist in his studios in Miami, just like because of this podcast. So again, all of those things are almost like accidental benefits that you get. But equally, I don't ever allow people to just start it to go, oh, well, I'll see what happens with it. Like, let's have an outcome. It's, you know, I'm an IPQA qualified performance coach as well. Mm-hmm. And on day one of coaching school, not a real school, but I imagine it is, the first thing they talk about is outcome thinking. Always with a client as a coach, you want to be getting them to keep thinking about what's the outcome. So I always start with, at that point, with clients, say, what are we trying to do this for? How are we going to monetize it further down the line? How are we going to add to the bottom line? The other thing as well, and you'll probably know this as a podcast yourself, it's an incredibly powerful call to action medium. So 56% of people, they did a survey last year, 56% of people will click a link in the show notes when instructed to do so by the show host. So you could say, hey, go and download my new book now. Hey, go and get on my email marketing list now. Hey, go and do this now. 56% of people will click that link when told to do so, as opposed to the online average, which is 4%. So a podcast for the same message is 14 times more impactful than other online mediums. So it's hugely, hugely powerful.
That's exciting for me. Very exciting.
Yeah. So make sure that all your call to actions and stuff are actually driving somewhere correctly. You know, make sure that your outro musics are pushing to that call to action, because a lot of people will be like, hey, connect with me on Insta, connect me on Facebook. Hey, you can find me on LinkedIn. You could download, join my group, join my mastermind project, blah, blah, blah. You're just giving people too much information. I would say send them, say, click the link in the show. If you'd like to find out more, click the link in the show notes now. You can obviously point the link to wherever you want it to go.
Great.
But ultimately, that's the call to action that I'd make people take. Click the link in the show notes. It's the easiest one to do.
Amazing. So we've got some questions here. So let me have a look. Ryan Grieve says, great to see James on here, and he's been following you since Champions of Mind. Amazing journey. So you've got a fan.
I've got a fan. Thanks, Ryan. We'll leave that there. We won't mention that time of my life again for legal reasons, but thanks. Cheers, Ryan.
Okay, and then Dan saying hello. So, guys, if you're listening in, James is here. He's a real expert, as you probably gathered, on monetizing podcasts and, in fact, anything to do with podcasts. So ask him. This is the reason why we do these podcasts live, because we do have the opportunity to engage and to get your questions answered. So, it's like a kind of live mastermind, these Thursday night sessions. So anyway, so put your questions in the chat box. Right. So James, let's talk about finding your topic, because I find this very, very interesting, because I sometimes see entrepreneurs and I think, well, it's really clear to me that you're about X. I don't know why, because I'm a real kind of people person, and I think, you would be great if you went on a podcast and you talked about this, because I can see that it's your gift and your talent. And then sometimes they come out with a podcast idea and I think, oh, you know what? That's not quite strong enough. It's the concept of a podcast has to cut through, doesn't it? And so what's your advice if somebody came to you and said, I'd love to do a podcast. I'm really excited about it, but I don't quite know where to start.
So it's a question I get a lot. I always tell people that your podcast is an extension of your brand. So the same message, the same look and feel that I get from Facebook, I should get from Twitter, and then from Twitter to Insta, and Insta to LinkedIn. Yes, they're all different platforms. Yes, you've got to treat them all slightly differently, even though I'm a fan of copying and pasting and just spamming stuff all over the place. Fundamentally, it's worked. So I know, but lots of people are like, no, you can't do that. You absolutely can. But fundamentally, your podcast's got to be an extension of your brand. You've got to think of it in that way. So therefore, if we take it a step back and go, well, what is your brand? I've worked with the likes of BMW, Nando's, Thomas Cook. I've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world in broadcast and PR. And I've heard so many people talk so much nonsense about branding and the word brand. So here's the only tip that you need to know about branding and brand ever. Your brand is your reputation. That's it. Just think of it that way. Your brand is your reputation. What do you want people to say about you when you walk out of the room? That's your brand. And your podcast should be an extension of your brand. So I would say, for example, I see this a lot, clients come to me and it's very obvious what they should be doing. But again, the job of a coach or a mentor, coach and mentors are different. Let me rephrase that. The job of a coach is not to give people answers. The job of a coach is to ask people questions so they create their own answers. And you guide them to make sure they get to the right answer ultimately. Because I've worked with a lot of coaches and they're just like, push you into a certain direction. It's like, that's not where that person should be going. Let them find their own way. Mm-hmm. But with regards to, what's your expertise? What lights you up? What makes you excited? But what also then lines up with your brand. So let's say, for example, you want to, you're mega passionate about transcendental meditation, but you want to make a podcast for your accountancy company. Is there a way you can come up with that crossover? Is there a way you can link the two together? But then understand you could do a podcast about accountancy, which you might find boring, but people have mega value, and then you generate clients, and then those clients and that revenue would enable you to pay to do your hobby. I do an exercise with people when I train them, is I look at their expertise and then I look at their interests. I make them write it down on a piece of paper, and I just make them list it for 5 minutes on, and I will sit there. I've done this on one-to-ones. I will sit there in silence for 5 minutes. I'll just look at them, because the magic as a coach is in the silence, and I let them come up with their own answers. And if there is stuff that crosses over and works well as a podcast that you can feed into it, great. And if not, okay, the exercise didn't bear any fruit. That's absolutely fine. But again, it's about being congruent to who you actually are, understand the brand that you're trying to create and the reputation that you're trying to craft. And again, go back to that whole thing of outcome thinking. What do you want this podcast to do? Because if you are an accountant who loves meditation and yoga, do you want to do a podcast that fires up your passion? Because that makes the the day-to-day of being an accountant more bearable. I don't know why I always slag off accountants. My dad was an accountant, so I don't mean it personally to accountants. But yes, but then equally that you're not realistically going to be able to monetize that content, but maybe it lights you up, fires you up, and it fuels your passion. But equally, if you want something that's going to generate revenue, you have to talk about it in a way where you can really shine your expertise. The thing is, as well, and we talked about this a minute ago, Jane, whilst not everybody's doing a podcast, the perception is that everybody is. So you really, if you're going to talk about a subject, you need to be an absolute expert, tactical practitioner of your craft these days. Don't start a branding podcast if you've done a Udemy course on brand. Don't just start a podcast about investing if you've been to one freebie weekend course. By all means, share your journey, document your journey, share your truth, but don't try and profess to, you've gone and you've been around somewhere for three days. Now all of a sudden you are the oracle to investing. Okay, chill your boots, big man. Let's just wind our neck in a little bit here. Let's gain some credibility and expertise, and then let's use the podcast platform to scale that expertise up effectively.
That's absolutely fantastic advice. And just to go back to a point that you made just before that, which was about the accountant, the yoga and meditation loving accountant. I often think that, that in a way that's a kind of hyper niche. And sometimes if people say to me that, oh, why do you do a podcast? And what could I do a podcast about? I mean, just people who probably would never do a podcast, but what would my podcast topic be? And I'll say, well, what are you really interested in? Single handicap, over 50s golfer, because it's when you have, like, the golfer is the thing, the accountant is the thing, but the differentiator is in the detail, isn't it? So the yoga and meditation loving accountant, it then gives you a little kind of hyper niche of your own, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that, that transcendental meditation and love of yoga makes you a better accountant. So maybe you can thread that through. And that's why I make people go through what's your expertise, your genuine expertise, and what are your genuine interests and passions, and see if there is that crossover. Because like you say, you might be able to, as an accountancy podcast, you can say, hey, look, we're about to get into January. We're about to, everyone's going to start doing the normal panicking thing. Let's just do an exercise. If you're overwhelmed by your account, if you're overwhelmed by your cash flow, if you look at zero and it makes you want to pull your own eyes out of your head, let me just do, weirdly, you guys will know if you've been listening to podcasts, I'm also mega into meditation. Let's just breathe in together. Let's breathe out together. I'm going to give you some tactical, practical advice on your accounts, but let's just get ourselves in the right frame of mind, the right state. Let's breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. It works. Jay Shetty talks about it. If Jay Shetty says it, it must be legit. So you could absolutely do that. And then again, that not only does it hyper niche you, which you're absolutely right, it shows who you are. So me now going, in this vanilla world of boring accountancy, now you've differentiated yourself. Now I've bought into you, because this is the thing. People have to buy into you before they will buy from you. Too many people stick a podcast out and be like, oh, I want the cash from it. I've done, 135, 140 odd podcasts now. I didn't monetize building the brand for the first 100 episodes. And now I'm starting to get very, very busy, and people come to me via the podcast or via my brand, or they find me on the podcast, which then sends them to LinkedIn and to Insta, which is what I talked about a minute ago. It's got to be an extension of your brand. So the person I am on my podcast, the person I am tonight on your live feed, the person that I am with my children, the people I am with my Instagram, I am the same person. Obviously, there's variants of you, but I am the same person. I'm pushing the same brand message in all of those places and platforms.
Amazing. I love it. And I think the other thing, of course, to people who are not podcasters, and some of our audience won't be, is that the reason why that kind of, the hyper niching that we talked about actually works is because, of course, there's a global audience, isn't there? And that to me, that is a thing that absolutely blows my mind, that I get people from all over the world that say, oh, I listened to your podcast episode. And
it's mad, isn't it? I love it.
Yeah, people in Singapore and Australia, and it's like, oh my God, this is, it really does blow your mind, because you think, whatever you are interested in, whatever your topic is, even if you were to launch a podcast on something that is, seems like you just think nobody out there in the world would be interested in this, they'd find you, wouldn't they?
Oh, 100%. I always use the example of finger crochet. I don't even know if that's a real thing, but I bet there's a finger crochet podcast, because there's, across iTunes, there's 19 top line categories. So you've got arts, business, health and fitness, family, lifestyle, travel, tech, science, religion. So those are 19 niche categories. Within those 19 categories, you've also got between 5 and 10 subcategories. So let's say you've got 19 categories. Let's say you've got an average of 5 or 6 subcategories per thing. You've got 100 proactive micro niches, and then there's micro niches within the micro niche. And again, this is the thing: you don't need Joe Rogan numbers. Yes, everyone wants. Joe Rogan, by the way, gets 190 million downloads a month. It's colossal, but you absolutely don't need that to have a successful business. You could have 100 people listen to your podcast. But to your point, it is absolutely organic. And this is another top tip that I give to all of my podcast clients, is make sure that your content is available on as many platforms as possible. So I just launched on a platform called Ghana, which is massive in India. And I'm now getting between 200 and 600 downloads a day just in India. I've got no business involvement there. I've got no link to them. I don't know anything about their lifestyle, their business, or whatever it may be. But now I'm getting people who are reaching out to me. Now I'm going to get business opportunities again, which will vicariously trickle down to me from the podcast. Could I go and deliver a business training in India? Might be a bit early, probably not during lockdown for legal reasons. But 2021, I could probably go out to India, put on an event based on the amount of people that I've got listening. I get more listeners in India now than I do in England.
Wow.
So I'm basically, I'm a big deal in Mumbai, it turns out. When I looked into the stats, I'm basically the biggest celebrity in Mumbai. I'm definitely not. But it's really exciting, because, like I say, it's a genuine organic audience. And this is another thing that I tell my coaching clients when I'm training them on podcasts: take away the numbers, take away listeners, think of them as people. So let's say 100 people listen to your podcast. And say I get between 200 and 600 people a day in India who I've never met, who value my content enough to spend the time and invest their time listening to my content. So when you take away the numbers or the listeners and you think of them as people, everyone's like, oh, I'd love to have a few. Well, what would you be like if you could put those 600 people in a room every day? How much attention would you pay to your content then? You'd polish up, your speech before you gave it on a stage in front of 600 people, wouldn't you? And that's the mentality I like to get people to start to adopt, because this is, people. I know it's said all the time. It's a bit cheesy, but the one thing you can never get more of is time.
Time.
So time. If people invest their time in your content, you better be respectful of that, because that's a big deal.
It is. It is, most definitely. So we've got a question. What advice do you have for someone launching their podcast to get them into the top 50 podcasts on iTunes? That's from
Dan. This is the secret sauce. I can't tell you that, Dan. It's all algorithmically genius. No, so basically, when you're launching, the launch part of that is very, very important, because the success or the failure of a podcast generally happens within the launch. I've worked with I worked on the Military Wives film launch. I've worked with independent brands. I've worked with quite big brands on their launches, but it doesn't matter. You've got to get the first part of it right. The reason for it is that the algorithm favors new shows much more heavily. So I've done a bit of sort of digging, and obviously all of the platforms are relatively reluctant to share data-based information. But from what I can work out, from having done shows that are doing 25, 30, 40,000 downloads a month, I reckon for every one download you get as a new podcast, it's the equivalent to 50 of an established show. So for every one download, I reckon it's worth 50 as a more established show. Not only a download, but a subscriber and a review and a rating. So any activity that you get on your account as a new subscriber, as a new podcast, is worth 50 times that as a more established one. So let's say on day one, and this is what I always do, I always funnel people to push to one specific time on one specific day to launch. And for 14 days prior to that, I've got a whole lot of 14-day promo process that I walk all of my clients through. I make them warm up the cold audience so that people are ready to download your content the day that it goes live. You've excited them. You've documented the journey and the process. I found 2 weeks to be the sweet spot. Anything more than 2 weeks, and people are like, all right, I get it, James, shut up. Just tell me when it goes live. I don't care. Anything less than that, and they haven't really bought in enough to the process that you're walking through with your podcast. But as I say, I've done 128 launches with 85 to 90% of people ending up in the iTunes top charts. It's not because I'm a media mogul. It's not because I'm, the UK's version of Gary Vee, try as I might. It's not because I only work with experts.
You're nearly there, James.
I'm pretty much there. I'm short of 749 staff, short of his 750, and about 101 million short of his 102 million pound wealth. But other than that, we're pretty much on par, me and GV. But yeah, so when I walk people through that process, the way that I've been able to make so many people successful with their launches is because of the launch strategy that I've got. Launch on one particular day, launch one particular time, and funnel all of the traffic to launch at that particular time. And then you want to make sure you've got, because what I see a lot of people do is they spend all their time and effort and energy making a great podcast they don't tell anybody about. So you've got to market the launch you're showing the correct way. So I use things like audiograms, which are like the little waveform videos. I use video promos. I use graphics. I make sure that if I've got a guest on, that I make graphics that feature them as well, and audiograms that feature them. I'll even go to the extent of when I share out an episode link, I'll use something like a Bitly or a shortening software, and I will make the guest's name the URL. So for this, if I was doing a podcast with you, which we're going to do one on my show in January, it will be Jane Bayler podcast, bit.ly/Jane Bayler podcast. So therefore, you're much more likely to share that with your crowd and community because I've made you feel good, because I've made you the important part of it. Even my artwork, there's me at the bottom right and there's the guest at the top left, slightly larger, intentionally, because I put you on the pedestal and you then want to share that content out. And then what that happens is, you put that because I'm going to make you sound good and look good on my show. You're going to share that in here, subconscious there, in this group with 2,500 people. Then I'm going to kidnap the audience. And I'm not going to take them anywhere. They're still going to be your fans as well and your followers as well. Sorry, Jane, I had to take that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you take them. I hate them all anyway. But fundamentally, that's how you can exponentially grow your podcast, because you could do little hacks and tactics like that. So launch on a particular day and push all the traffic there for a 14-day period, Dan, just to sort of summarize, and make sure that you market the launch of that podcast really hard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so James, can you relaunch a podcast? If you're, because I didn't really put a lot of effort. I was really busy when I launched mine, and I didn't really know about any of this stuff. So I did a little bit, but I just kind of put it out there, really. I probably missed a trick. So as a result, my audience started off as a trickle. And because obviously I've got the group and I've been, promoting it, Dan's been helping me promote it across my various social media, it's kind of grown organically. But I probably missed that golden opportunity. And so does this happen sometimes that people, they do a relaunch? Can they get back into that place where they have that opportunity again? Yeah,
it's feasible. It's much more difficult, I'm not going to lie, because obviously you've already got an established show. So you've got a couple of methods you could do. Then you could either restart a new show. Well, I wouldn't suggest that you do that, because I've had people like, I'm going to just start again. I'm like, don't do that. You've already got a listening audience. Again, let's take the way audience numbers. Those are people who follow your content, they've subscribed, they get it daily on their phone. This is the amazing thing, that this is the sort of the misunderstood power of podcasting. If I subscribe to a podcast, whenever you go live, it goes automatically onto my device. You can get onto my phone. Mm-hmm. Depending on my settings, I will even get a little notification pops up that goes, there's a new episode of the Smart Connect podcast on my home screen. So it's mega powerful. So I wouldn't suggest that you unless you've had zero traction, which obviously yours hasn't. It has had much more than that. If you've got no traction, by all means, sack off, start again, and reutilize this 14-day promo process. What I would probably do for a more established show, if it has got a listening audience, is I'd do a relaunch, and I'd probably bring it out as like a series 2. So I'd take a break for say 4 to 6 weeks. I can see the cogs turning now. You're like, Dan, are you taking notes, Dan? Dan, are you taking notes? I hope you are.
Aren't you, Dan?
So I'd probably take a break for maybe 4, 6, even 8 weeks, something like that, to make the audience kind of miss that the content's there. And then I'll do that 14-day promo process for season 2. Seasons and series didn't really happen even a couple of years ago, but the launch of things like Serial and Startup and all of the big, Gimlet Media, NPR, the ones that bring out series, Business Wars by Wondery, they've made it really commonplace for series and seasons to be a thing. So I would take a break and relaunch as a season 2. because what you want to be doing as a podcaster, really, you want to be putting consistent content out on a weekly basis. But I know, again, for a lot of people, that's quite a big ask. If you've got multiple businesses that you're running and social media channels and blah, 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 it can become, you know, another thing on your mega long list of marketing things to do each week. So it can be a bit of a chore. So it's a nice way to look at it, because you could go, right, I'll take a break. I'm going to then hammer it for 10 weeks. I'll do 10 weeks of content. I'll maybe do like an 8-episode series over 10 weeks, because I'll do a couple of like little promo shows to start with. Then you could take another 4 to 6 weeks off. Then you come back with season 3. So doing that seasonal way or series-based way, I think would work really nicely.
I love that. You know, a bit like broadcast media, really. It's the same kind of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because it is an entertainment medium, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why it works, I think, because we're already conditioned to be used to that. Like, you know, we're used to seasons in the States being, you know, between 12 and 24 episodes long. We're used to, short form entertainment series, especially in the UK, being, you know, between 6 and 8 episodes. Chris Evans launched a podcast a couple of weeks ago, actually, called How to Act. It's a great podcast, fantastic. And he launched with 10 episodes so that people could binge, you know, the whole concept of binge watching. He was like, binge listen to 10 episodes. I think he probably missed a trick. I think 10's a bit too much, to be fair, especially as some of them are like 2.5, 3 hours long. These episodes are mega. But that whole like binge concept really, really works nicely. So we're already conditioned to consume content in a series. But even like now, you know, Netflix and Amazon Prime and all the streaming platforms have changed the way that we consume content, but we still do it in seasons and series. So that's why it can work for podcast and audio as well.
That's an amazing, amazing idea. So let me have a look. Okay. Just lots of people saying nice things, James. So
I will take that. No questions, but nice things. It means they're either not engaged or they're just wowed by the wisdom.
Yes. So what about YouTube, James? Do you recommend that your mentees or the people that you coach upload their podcast episodes to YouTube as well?
So the answer to this 6 months ago would have been no. I said, you know, do it as a separate entity. However, I then done a bit of digging. There was a big sort of like digital media survey that came out, and 37% of people who were surveyed, and it was a couple of thousand people, so it wasn't a massive pool of people, but it wasn't small either. And 37% of people said that they listen to podcasts via YouTube. So yes, I'd say depends on the medium that you've got. I think first and foremost, podcasting is audio based. So what I hate listening to is people where it's like, oh, look at the screen. Oh, look at this. Oh, do you remember this? Oh, what are you wearing? Oh my God, look at him. Oh, I can't believe that. Then I feel like I'm not part of the joke. I'm not part of the journey. I'm not part of the process. I feel like it's secondary medium. I almost feel a little bit, not mugged off, but I feel a bit shortchanged almost, if that makes sense. So if you're going to do it, that's fine. But remember that podcast is a one-to-one medium, and you can get people where they are not going to be distracted by Facebook ads because they're in the car, or they're on the cross trainer, or they're in the gym, or they're on the commute, or they're walking the dog. You can get to them. You can get to people at a time where no other medium can reach them. So again, respect the art form. Maybe that's because I've been a broadcaster. I'm like, respect the goddamn audio, man, because it's not, it's really, really powerful. But equally, these days, especially with lockdown, etc., Be Live, Zoom, Riverside FM, Zencaster, Squadcast, all these platforms enable you to do StreamYard, enable you to do video at the same time. With Zoom, by default, it records an MP4 of the whole call for you anyway. So why wouldn't you? I'd at least, but I wouldn't stick it on just as it is plain. Like you've got that like cool sort of graphic and border and all that kind of stuff. Get yourself one of them made up. Do the recordings. Here you go. Look at this. We've just gone literally 74% more professional just with a click of a button. But you can now record this. And why not stick this onto YouTube? Because even if you get 10% of the people that consume the content on the audio then watch it on video as well, it's a free platform. Why wouldn't you be there? So yes, do it, but don't do it at the detriment of the quality of the audio, if that makes sense. But again, if you're using Squadcast, StreamYard, Be Live, whatever, you can do this stuff by default anyway. So why wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm. Right. Another question, James, is about interviews versus, your own content.
Yeah.
Now, I actually started off, I did a little mini series on influence and persuasion. So that was how I kind of launched. But then since then, I've really focused on interviews, and personally, because my business is a smart connector, then interviews, connections, actually building relationships, understanding how people build their businesses and bringing that out to the world has been something that's been quite important to me. So I'm actually ready now to really start pushing out a lot more of my own content, which is why I'm probably going to do a series 2 and actually talk really about my expertise and my history and the lessons that I can really give to other people. But for people that are starting out in a podcast, would you advise that they start out with interviews, or they do their own stuff, or a mixture of both? What's your thought on that?
It's going to be a very boring answer, but I'm going to go back to it again. Outcome thinking. What is it you actually want this podcast to do for you? Do you want to be the authoritative voice within the marketplace? Then you can do solo stuff. If you want to use it for connections, then you could do interview stuff. The great thing with podcasting is that although you can create kind of like your own little format for a show, it doesn't have to be formulaic. You know, it's not like in the world of radio. Like when I was on the radio, you had to start at a certain time, finish at a certain time, have advert breaks. You had to say certain stuff and not say other certain stuff. You had to like lead into a track, and then you had to like, you know, tease to a thing that was coming up later on in the show and blah, blah, blah. You had all these rules and regulations and red tape, and you had to sort of like, you know, dance to the beat of somebody else's drum effectively. Whilst I think it's nice to have like kind of a rough idea of what you want the show to be about, you don't have to be formulaic with it. So I would say, completely depends on what you want this podcast to do. I personally, though, having said that, I did find it really difficult to do solo stuff. I would find that I just couldn't get my words out. I found it boring. I was like, what am I talking about here? I distract myself. I'm like, is this boring? Is this interesting? So I love interviewing other people. But again, my whole thing was, when I started building the brand, I never had the intention to launch the podcast agency. I never had any intention to utilize it as a way of connecting with other people. But really, the amount of people that I've been able to connect with, to your point a minute ago, via the podcast has been nuts. You know, the Les Brown speaking event was via the podcast.
Big name.
Grant Cardone, Elena Cardone, Mr. Universe, Rob Law, MB, the guy who invented the trunky suitcase, Joseph Valente, you know, all these people that are now within my network. The first person I ever interviewed actually for Building the Brand podcast is a guy called Gary Rhodes, and he's the most successful person you've never not heard of. Never not heard of. Yeah. So he's very like under the radar. He's business partners with Tony Robbins. And he said to me, like, come for dinner with me. And we went to this fancy restaurant and had steak and frites in the West End of London. It was all very nice. You can only have steak or chips all together. It's really random. You can't choose what you have. They just give it to you and you just say thank you because it's that good. The food is unreal. But literally that connection for the first ever episode. And again, I could not make this stuff up. He was the first connection for this new podcast I was going to launch by myself. And he asked me a question during that dinner, which changed the direction of my life. And if it wasn't for the podcast, I would not have been in that room with him. And he's the reason why I went and met the world's leading human biologist. He's the reason why I've ended up training people who've been on Britain's Got Talent. He's the reason why I've launched a whole subsection of this new branding agency concept that we've got. It's just been mental. So, but again, it just depends on what you want to do a podcast for. Interviews are an amazing way. Because if you imagine, right, you could, you know, get hold of Grant Cardone and go, hey, GC, you know, don't suppose you fancy a coffee for 60 minutes, do you? There's not a chance in hell he's having a coffee with you for 60 minutes. But say, hey, GC, would you like to come onto my podcast? By the way, it's an iTunes top 10 podcast here in the UK. We've got an audience of business owners and entrepreneurs. I think the audience will get a lot of value from you. Absolutely, he would. You know, Grant Cardone only follows about 1,000 people on Instagram, and he's got about 7-8 million people who follow him. I'm one of those 1,000 people. So when he goes live, I'm one of the only of 1,000 people that can go. He can invite in. So it happened a couple of months back. I was sitting there on Instagram just scrolling through, and it's like, Grant Cardone would like you to join in live. And I was like, huh? And I got about 50, 60 followers within about 3 seconds of finishing that conversation with him. And it was mad. But that relationship would never have been there if it wasn't for the podcast. But again, just to get around celebrities and influencers for no purpose, there's no point in that either.
No, but I mean, as you said, it's building a network. And actually, I did an interview which has only just been released with the founder of Barefoot Wines. And they had a most amazing story. They are one of the most popular wine brands in the world.
Yeah.
And they were sold to Ernst & Gallo for £100 million. And they just started off, they were like a real hippie brand in this little place in California. The reason why they're called Barefoot is because they're actually treading the grapes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they just grew from absolutely nothing, and they got a fantastic story, and then sold their business for £100 million. And I was actually introduced to them by a guy called Ryan Foland, who is a personal brand expert. They're all over in California. And it's the thing that I love is just the ease of access, really, to these incredible, inspirational, international people that, I mean, we couldn't have gone to a networking event in London and met people like that, could we?
No, that's it.
And that is the strength of the podcast interviews, that you can really pick and choose the people who you think have got a really interesting story. And then that shapes your podcast, doesn't it?
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Come back, these are interesting people.
I tell you what, the other interesting thing is that it's not always the people that you expect that's going to give you the biggest impact. So I did an interview, weirdly, earlier in the year, just because of lockdown, everything was happening, and we were expecting our second child. I said to my wife, I was like, let me interview you. She's run multi-million-pound business. Do you remember Psychic Sally?
Yeah,
like the TV celebrity. She used to manage her, so she was the person who turned her into Psychic Sally, basically. Very successful in that world, and then became a mum, and we run property management companies, etc. I said, let me well, I didn't say let me interview you. She kept going, when are you going to interview me? But no one wants to hear that conversation of a husband and wife on a podcast. But it turns out people did. We got loads and loads of the most listeners I've ever had was for that interview. Wow. It was genuinely ridiculous. That subsequently led on to Hayley saying, do you reckon I should do some more interviews? I was like, yeah, you've got loads of acumen and knowledge to share. People do it. She went onto a podcast literally a couple of weeks ago. And off the back of that one podcast, somebody reached out to her and said, hey, I love what you're all about. I love the fact that you do graphic design, web design, but you actually sort of get involved on the business side of it as well. And you don't just do the design, but you help to craft the business. Will you work with me? That has turned into a £12,000 client. Wow. Off the back of one podcast. So that, again, that's the power of this medium is insane. And there's all these auxiliary benefits you don't even necessarily know about when you get started. So again, the importance of understanding, why are you really doing what you're doing? Because I nearly interviewed Jay Shetty a couple of weeks ago for his book launch. It was all lined up with his book publisher, HarperCollins. It was in the diary. It was in his diary. And then the week he launched, I saw he was on Lewis Howes, Ed Milet, Steve Weatherford, like the megastar podcast. And I was like, message HarperCollins, like, we're still on for this week. They went, yeah, he's really looking forward to it. I'm thinking, Jay Shetty ain't looking forward to it. You kidding me? Anyway, the day before, they're like, yeah, I'm really sorry, Jay can't do it. And I was like, of course, Jay can't do it. But that, for me, what would have been the outcome of that? Is it nice to interview Jay Shetty? Would have got a load of listeners? Yeah, absolutely. But then I would have leveraged that for the next 18 months to get more people in. So again, it's about the outcome for me. It's not just Jay Shetty. Do I want to be friends with Jay Shetty? Yeah, I do. But I'm going to say not really, to protect my ego, especially if he snubbed me. But then the outcome for it is, what does that do for my business? It just puts more awareness on me. And again, as someone who's teaching people podcasting, I can now talk to you about how to secure the likes of Jay Shetty for your podcast. And now, actually, obviously, you can't talk about that because I don't know how to do it successfully because I failed miserably. But that's the sort of the outcome that I was thinking of in advance.
Yeah, I mean, look, you came that close. Jay Shetty, he's there for you. He's just a whisker away.
He is.
Yes.
He is. But it's interesting because now HarperCollins, I've got a good relationship with the guys at HarperCollins. And there's been other people that are like, oh, did you do the Jay Shetty interview? I know other people who know him, and he's connected with me back and forth a couple of times. And then Jim Quick got in contact on Insta. And then I've reached out to the body coach and all these weird little relationships. Now we're going to launch another podcast in December called Pandemic Positives. Like the lights. I think the tagline is going to be, sprinkling glitter on the turd that was 2020. I quite like that as a concept. But we're going to talk to like people like Captain Tom, and there's a lad who's been sleeping out in a tent for 200 days to raise money for a local charity, and just like people like that. But I can only, and again, the outcome for that, understanding that in advance, has to be a hell of a lot of work, hell of a lot of production time. It will cost me a lot of money because I'm going to have to pay my team to produce the content. But fundamentally, there will be a business outcome for it that I understand before I press the record button.
That is absolutely amazing. Well, listen, James, we've been talking for for around 50 minutes. So it's been absolutely fantastic to have such a great interview with you. You've given so much value to the group and to the podcast. And
my pleasure.
Thank you very, very much for coming on tonight.
Thank you for having me.
We will keep in touch. And
absolutely.
On your podcast as well in January. I can't wait.
Yeah, 100%. Anyone in the group who's watching this radio, who's listening on the podcast, if you're like, oh, I've got more questions, just connect me here on Facebook or find me, search Ultimate Podcast Group and pop me an email or whatever. I'm more happy to help people out, jump on a call or send you some details or send you a blueprint or a cheat sheet that I've created. So yeah, find me, hunt me down.
Amazing. Okay, so that's James Burtt, Ultimate Podcast Group.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so get in touch with James, because I'm sure that if you're thinking of launching a podcast, well, hopefully by now you will realize that he is a massive expert, and with his help, you'll go further, faster. That's it.
Absolutely.
All right, lovely. Thank you very much again, James.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, Jane. Bye now.